Apple has just launched the iPad Air 5, which is now surprisingly close in terms of features to the iPad Pro. Ours is coming in just a few days, so until then, I want to go over 6 different categories and give you my thoughts on if it's actually worth buying the iPad Air over the iPad Pro. I'm going to be using the iPad Air 4 for reference here, as everything in the iPad Air 5 is identical to the 4, aside from the chip, which is now the M1 compared to the Apple A14, the front camera, which now supports center stage, and the 5G connectivity. Everything else, including the speakers, is exactly the same. The first thing that you need to be aware of is the price difference, which you should keep in mind throughout the entirety of this video. So the iPad Air starts from $600, and this is for the baseline 64GB model. The iPad Pro starts from $800, so $200 more, but that is for the 128GB model. The iPad Air does not actually have a 128GB variant. The next tier is 256, which costs $750. So just out of the gate, if you think you need more than 64GB of storage, then getting the iPad Pro is actually a better deal. As for $50 more than the 256GB iPad Air, you get a ton of extra features, although with half the storage compared to the iPad Air. So let's talk about those differences, starting off with the design. And here, the Air and the Pro look almost identical to each other, aside from 3 minor differences, which are the camera module on the back, the thickness, with the iPad Pro being 0.2mm thicker, which you honestly won't even notice, and the fact that you get way more color options with the iPad Air. With the iPad Pro, you can only pick between space gray and silver. The iPad Air does have space gray, but it strangely lacks silver. However, it does have 4 extra colors: pink, blue, and purple, which is a new color for the iPad Air 5. Now, I do need to make you aware that these colors are incredibly pale. They're so pale that I can barely even tell that this iPad Air is green. It's sort of like Apple dropped the saturation slider to 1%. It is noticeable at certain angles, but at most angles, this looks more like silver. It's a shame that Apple didn't make the colors as vibrant as on the iPhones, or especially the new iMacs. That would have looked so nice. But what about the display? Well, there are 3 big differences here, with the biggest one being ProMotion, with the iPad Pro's display being able to display double the frames per second, up to 120 compared to just 60 on the iPad Air. Now, most people won't need ProMotion, but once you've used it for a bit, it would be so difficult to go back to a standard 60Hz display. Simply using the iPad Air now feels so laggy and so slow compared to the iPad Pro. Now, having ProMotion does not only mean more fluid animations and more fluid scrolling through your web pages, it also means that when you're using the Apple Pencil, it will feel way more fluid, and the drawing and writing will feel more like actually drawing on a piece of paper. On top of this, games will also be able to run at up to 120 frames per second on the iPad Pro versus 60 on the iPad Air. As you can see, we have an extra ultra toggle on the Pro in COD Mobile. So if you do care about playing some competitive games and you need that 120Hz refresh rate, then definitely go with the iPad Pro. The second display difference is the brightness. So the iPad Pro can go up to 600 nits, while the Air can only go up to 500. Not really a major difference indoors, but if you do plan on using your iPad outdoors, the Pro is going to be a bit more visible. And the third display difference is the actual display size. So because of the slightly thicker bezels on the iPad Air, its display is also a tiny bit smaller by 0.1 inches. Not a massive deal, but something to keep in mind. So display-wise, the iPad Pro takes this one, but for probably 90% of you who will be using the iPad as just an everyday tablet, you'll honestly be just fine with the iPad Air's display too. So what about features? Is there anything that the iPad Pro offers that the iPad Air does not? The biggest one here being Face ID, which the iPad Pro has, while the iPad Air relies on the fingerprint reader, which is built into the power button. For me, this is actually a pretty big deal, as when I'm unlocking my iPad, I don't have to look for the power button to do so. It just automatically unlocks the moment it sees my face. And although the iPad Air does actually give you a visual indicator as to where the Touch ID button is, it's just not as convenient as with the iPad Pro. That Face ID system also gives you Animojis and Memojis. It also gives you the ability to take portrait mode shots on the front with studio lighting effects. So it does actually give you some extra functionality rather than simply unlocking the iPad faster. On top of this, the iPad Pro also has a 4-speaker system compared to the dual speaker system on the iPad Air. So as you could probably tell, the iPad Pro was not only louder than the Air, but it also had more bass and clarity. The iPad Pro also features Thunderbolt with up to 40 gigabit per second transfer speeds, while the Air does not have Thunderbolt and offers up to 10 gigabits per second. I wouldn't really worry too much about this one, as the iPad's Files app is still very limited, and you also need to have a Thunderbolt drive to take advantage of this Thunderbolt port anyways. The iPad Pro also has a faster 5G with millimeter wave support if you live in the US, which can give you those insane speeds of over 1 gigabit per second. And the iPad Pro also has the LiDAR scanner on the back, which is super useful to have in AR, as you can add objects, you can measure things, you can even scan entire rooms in 3D. Now, the iPad Air can do all of this too, but as you can probably tell, it is nowhere near as accurate. It actually thinks that we are on the floor now because of that single camera module on the back. The iPad Pro also features a secondary camera module on the back, which is the ultra-wide module, which can be useful in a lot of situations, as you can probably tell. We also have a flash on the back, which is quite useful to be used as a torch at night. They both offer center stage on the front, as well as Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil 2 support. Overall, features-wise, if you need Face ID or the improved speakers or Thunderbolt or millimeter 5G, the extra camera, flash, or that LiDAR scanner on the back, then definitely do go with the iPad Pro. Now, let's talk about the raw performance, because this is where it gets really interesting. Both the iPad Air and the Pro now have Apple's M1 chip, which means that you get a ridiculous level of performance, better than most Windows laptops actually, in a tablet that is just a few millimeters thin. That is crazy. However, unless you are a professional who uses Lightroom, Photoshop, and maybe edits some videos too, creates music and that kind of stuff, you won't really benefit from the true power of the M1. So the main actual benefit of the M1 is just in terms of longevity. If we go by some of Apple's longest supported devices, both of these iPads should be getting updates for at least the next 7 years. There are a couple of more differences here. For example, the iPad Pro offers you more storage options with 512 gigabytes, 1 terabyte, and 2 terabytes, while the iPad Air caps at 256 gigabytes. If you're a creative professional and you need more storage, then the iPad Pro is the best choice here. And if you do get that 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte models of the iPad Pro, those would also come with 16 gigabytes of RAM instead of 8, like the Pro and the Air come with. And that also means that you get double the video memory, which some 3D apps and applications and even games could benefit from. So, okay, having said all of this, is it worth spending $200 more to get the iPad Pro? Well, my answer is just no. The only reason to consider the iPad Pro is, in my opinion, for the larger 12.9-inch model, which you cannot get with the iPad Air. That model also gives you a mini LED display with an even higher peak brightness, which is great to have for anyone who does intend to use the iPad Pro as a true professional creative device. To be honest, I wouldn't even recommend spending $600 on the iPad Air 5 in the first place, as you can actually find a refurbished 11-inch iPad Pro for $520. This is the A12Z model, so not quite as powerful as the M1, but definitely powerful enough for all of your needs, as you do get things such as ProMotion, Face ID, and all the other extra features of the iPad Pro. By the way, I'm actually still using a 2018 iPad Pro myself with the Apple A12X chip, and even that is crazy smooth, it never lags on me, and I can do anything that I want on it, including editing 4K videos if I really want to. But yeah, let me know in the comments which one would you get and why, and definitely stay tuned for more Apple device videos. We have a big delivery coming in a few days, so stay tuned for a lot of videos on those. I'm Daniel, this has been Zen of Tech, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Zen of Tech, signing out. Cheers.